Welcome. Today we are going to talk about vintage fountain pens. And this is a niche within a niche. This is something that, not a lot of people even know about fountain pens or care to experience them. And then an even fewer care to delve into this deep dive of the fountain pens. So, why do I like vintage pens? So, first off, I'm just going to get this right out there. I love history. I love reading about history. I ended up getting a degree in history by accident just because I took so many elective courses when I was in college for history. They were like, hey, you've got a history degree. And I was like, cool, look at that. So I just enjoy history. This fulfills a really cool niche in my life. So that said, let's get into a little bit of fountain pen history. So fountain pens were pretty much around since, the mid 1800s or so. Before that, you know what I mean? It was like the quill, the feather, and your inkwell, your dip pens. So then they kind of invented the fountain pen, and it was a beautiful thing. And they were able to, have a pen that you could carry with you. That was an amazing thing. Think about how that changed the course of history. To have a pen that you could carry with you in your pocket and use. That is insane. That's like the equivalent of a cell phone versus a landline. Do you know what I mean? So that is a really cool thing about fountain pens. Now, they were only really around for 150 years, and by really, I mean that's where they were in heavy rotation and heavy use before ballpoints became the de facto. And we still obviously do have fountain pen companies and fountain pens around, but it's a very different world. What do I mean by that? I mean that let's look at motorcycles, for example, right? In the early 1900s, there was over 150 motorcycle makers in America. After the 30s and 40s, that pared down to just a handful. The same could be said of fountain pens. So in the early, 1850s all the way up through the 1950s, there was a lot of different brands of American fountain pen makers. By the 1950s, most of that had faded out in lieu of the ballpoint, right? So that's kind of our overall ebb and flow of the history of the fountain pen, and also why one of the reasons I really enjoy it is because it's a perfect mix of, my passion and my appreciation for history, my passion in writing, my appreciation of history. So okay, let's get back to it. So over that 150 years, you've got different fill mechanisms. You could always have a dropper pen, and that's where you physically unscrew the body, use an eyedropper to literally put ink inside the body, and then, you've got some sort of grease or something to kind of align the threads so it doesn't escape. So there's always been dropper pens. That's, you can always get that. I don't personally like dropper pens, way too messy for me. The next option in history is a lever fill. Lever fill, however you want to pronounce that. And basically what that is this pen contains a sac within its body. That sac is depressed when you pull up this lever. Now, when you push back the lever to its normal position here, it allows that sac to expand, creates a vacuum, and carries your ink for you. The next thing you've got after that, you had button fills, right? So they were able to kind of design something like this where you push the button that activates kind of a plunger on the inside, and that's what creates your vacuum action, so much so that these pens were called vacuumatics. So that's what creates that vacuum action to kind of suck up your ink. One of the latest inventions before fountain pens fell out of use was a snorkel, and I actually might have one of those on the way for review, so that'll be cool. But that was in the 1950s or so. They came up with a little tiny snorkel that literally poked out of the nib, and you just had to put that little tiny bit of the snorkel into the ink. You didn't have to submerge your entire nib and then clean it, as I do, and as I've shown you in previous videos. So after the snorkel, though, that was kind of fountain pen's last real attempt. But after that, it just ballpoints, they won out. I'm sad to say, guys, you probably already know this. The ballpoints won out. Why did they win out? It was just a matter of simplicity, really. So ballpoints had been around for over 20 years by the 50s or so, but they really came into their own in the 50s with that disposable Bic, right? That's where the Bic came out. Hey, for a cheap, a very cheap thing, you could have a pen that works. It's a waterproof ink, it dries super fast, and it's a permanent ink. It's not a water-based ink. So ballpoints went out, but that is what it is. Fountain pens have still continued, like we had talked about. So about this time, after the snorkel in the 1950s, that's when the Parker came out with the first cartridge fountain pen, which was another way to try and modernize the fountain pen. And that one was a review I did recently. It was a Parker 45. Thank you to Browning for that. After that, we had converter pens, right? So then you see, instead of the cartridge, which became all the rage, then you had a converter, which you could choose your inks. And that's where we sit today. So none of these, actually, this latest one from the 60s is converter, but that's where we sit today. All right, so first off, why do you love the vintage fountain pens? So like I said, I personally just love history, okay? So if you like history, this is a really cool thing. Some of these pens are 100 years old or older, okay? Most of these are approaching that age. So as a historian, as just someone who loves history, that is a cool thing. Now let's take a look at some of the other features here, okay? So most of your early pens are going to be ebonite. Ebonite is basically like a type of rubber. It's very porous, it's very light, it's very kind of bouncy. And that's often what you find feeds out of, right? Ebonite. So that, you know, most of these feeds are all ebonite. Well, actually, all these feeds are ebonite as far as I'm aware. So ebonite comes in a couple different forms. This is a chased ebonite, which is kind of like an ebonite that they'd made more resilient and resistant to damage. This one is a maybe Todd. Let's go through these, actually. So the reason I've got these pens ordered as they are is this kind of takes you through history. So this is a 1917-1918 Wahl. This was right after Wahl, W-A-H-L. That company bought out the 10-Point Company in New York. That was, another American maker that was, popular in New York, and that was basically this pen. So they took the 10-Point Company over. They made a 10-point model that was the 10-Point, basically. So one of the coolest things about these, this little ball right here. There are some modern makers that have this ball. This is the most amazing clip, guys. I can't just say enough about these little rollerball clips. I love them. So this is a really cool vintage thing that fell out of, common usage up until very kind of more recently. Another reason to love a vintage. We've got our 1918 pen there, right? Like World War I. How cool is this too? So this one actually had an engraving there, EEG. So whoever, owned this and used this was, that was their initials. I imagine it's Edwin because I played Assassin's Creed Black Flag. So I like to think this was an Edwin. But, that's a really just kind of nice touch. Let's go to the next one. This is a 1920s. So this is a 1920s Eggins and Hambler. Eggins and Hambler were two guys that worked for the Waterman Company for over a decade apiece. And then they left in the 1920s and they said, hey, we're going to do this our own way and try and make even better pens from what we've learned working for Waterman. So they started their own company. Obviously, they had some cool contracts because this one was actually made for the Dipartimento Italiano in the American State Bank and Trust Company. So this was a pen that was given to bankers of a certain stature at some point. And I love the gold leaf celluloid in there. This is 1920s. How cool is that? Now, the decadence of the 1920s, right? Then we go into the 1930s. And this is just happenstance. You can certainly get fancier pens than this, but I kind of thought this was a nice contrast. This is a Maybe Todd. This is a 1930s pen from England. Maybe Todd did also make American pens during this era, but this one happens to be from England. The Swan, as this one is their flagship model. So this was a flagship pen back in the day. We've got our 1910s, we've got our 1920s, we've got our 1930s, here's our 1940s. This is a 1940 to 41. Parker Duovac Sr. And I'll do reviews on all these pens individually at some point. But this is a pen from, right before World War II, right during the start of World War II. So how cool is that? I just love the history, then, aside from the feel and everything, thinking about the fact that this pen was around at that point and Americans used it during World War II, that's just really cool to me. So we've got a beautiful example of a nice striped vacuumatic here. And then I don't have anything from the 1950s. This one is from the 1960s, though. So this is a cool designed pen where it's, comparatively, it's much more futuristic, right? It's almost like a, Buck Rogers spaceship or something like that. Now, the one thing that makes this one more usable than the rest, I will say, is the fact that it does come with a converter. So I can use more modern inks without care. So what does that mean? All right, let's get into some of the downsides of getting into the vintage hobby. So the potential downsides of a vintage fountain pen, it's really old. You don't know what you're completely getting. So the nib could be damaged. Most of these older pens have that sack on the inside. Most of those sacks are close to 100 years old now, and many have disintegrated. Many don't work, many leak. So If you are going to get a vintage fountain pen, personally, I would get one that's been refurbished, refinished with a new sack installed. That's not something that's easily done. It's best left to people who know what they're doing. I personally don't know how to do it yet. I'd love to know, but that's something that is outside of the scope of an average fountain pen user. You kind of need a new sack if you're getting an old pen. That sack itself is also sensitive to the inks that you use. So a vintage pen is very sensitive to the inks that you use. Basically, long story short, that ink needs to be as close as possible to neutral. Some inks go way off the scale as far as being, more alkaline, more acidic. And that can disintegrate, put early wear and tear on that sack, and then your sack can just basically disintegrate and bust open at some point, which is like every fountain pen user's nightmare. So you need to be very careful with your ink considerations when you're using a lever fill pen. So that really limits your inks as well. Lever fill pens also have a more limited capacity as compared to everyday pens that we're familiar with nowadays. But then when you think about it, when these were in common usage, everybody had an inkwell in their den. Everybody had an escritoire. When these pens were around, it was common, right? You could literally walk into anybody's house and be like, oh, I'm out of ink. Here, just let me dip this in. Let's go ahead and show you how that's done too. So we're going to dip this in. We're going to kind of get our finger under the little lever there. We're going to go all the way down, and then we're going to go up, and we're going to leave it in there for a little bit, and that's going to suck up our ink. All right. Now I'm going to cap the ink and clean this off. Now you can even see some of the nibs you need to be careful with your ink. This pen arrived with that staining on it there because someone along the way used an ink that was too far alkaline or acidic, and it imparted some damage to this nice gold nib there. Nothing that affects its usability, but it's aesthetically just something that's there, and that's a reminder that, these pens, you have to be careful with the inks that you choose. All right, so this one is inked up and cleaned now. So we were talking about disadvantages of fountain pens. We talked about how they are older, so you don't know what you're going to get. We talked about how the lever fills often might need a new sack installed. That might be something that is more expensive because it needs to be done by a professional of sorts. And then we've got our next thing that was kind of a surprise to me coming to, from modern pens to vintage pens, the size. The size is smaller, just objectively. So this is a vest model. So that's one thing. It posts really well. It's meant to be small. These are full-size models here, okay? This is a full-size model. This was their flagship full-size model. This Senior Duovac was called a Senior because it was their biggest model. So these are as big as you're getting in the vintage world. Now let's compare that to, an average fountain pen of today, okay? There we go. This one's the biggest, so I'll take that one. All right, so look at this, right? So our average fountain pen today is still way bigger than even the biggest vintage, really. Now I'm sure you can find some sort of oversized example, but in generalities, this is the case. Here's even a vanishing point. So the sizing is surprising coming from the modern world. The vintage pens are going to be smaller, and that's just something that you will have to become accustomed to or learn to appreciate, as I've done, because most things back in the day were smaller. It's kind of a weird oddity nowadays that bigger and bigger and bigger is the obsession, right? My newest pen, the Mag 600, is bigger than all the other pens I own, for example. So it's just kind of an interesting niche in the vintage world. Most of them are going to be smaller than your average, everyday, common girth fountain pen today. So now let's talk about some of the advantages of vintage fountain pens. So some of the advantages of vintage fountain pens are the pricing. Even though you've got to look for one that's nice, it's restored, it's got the particular nib size that you're looking for, when you find that, it is a beautiful thing, and it can be had for way less potentially than you would have to pay for a modern pen. And what I mean by that is at these price points, what I paid for all of these, I would be looking at a modern pen and going all in on the body or all in on the nib. I couldn't have both ways. I couldn't have my cake and eat it too. All of these are having my cake and eat it too. I've got a gold body. I've got a beautiful celluloid. I've got another beautiful celluloid. All of these have gold nibs. So if you're looking for value for getting a gold nib with amazing performance, that is where the vintages have a real chance to shine. Not only that, but let's talk more about one of the things that makes the vintages kind of this, holy, kind of put on high on that pedestal. Why is that? That's because of the nibs. Now, these were designed in a time where literally everybody used these every day. Everybody had an inkwell in, their escritoire that you could easily, just be like, oh, I'm out of ink. Hey, can I, borrow a cup of sugar? Hey, can I have a little bit of ink from your inkwell? Same deal, right? So these nibs were designed with way more high usage in mind, and their reliability and flexibility is something to be admired, okay? So one thing is one, right? So if you appreciate a fine nib or a medium nib or even a bold nib, you can do that, right? But one of the things that sets the vintage world apart is something called a Superflex. And that is a pen with this nib here. This is a number 2 nib. This thing is more flexy than pretty much anything on the modern market today. And it's got a different feel than pretty much anything on the modern market today. All right, so we're going to look at some examples, right? So this is 2 examples from, actually, this pen right here is the 1930s Maybe Todd Swan. And this pen here is the 1918 Wall 10-point. So these are 2 writing examples of these vintage pens. And one thing you can see is that beautiful line variation. So look how small that Maybe Todd Swan writing is compared to the D or the B of, Diamine or Borealis. So you've got really, really big line variation. That is something that is highly sought after. Here's another example, the 1918 Wall 10-point, Look at the B again. You can see some line variation. So let's see what that looks like right now. This 1930s Maybe Todd from England is actually one of my favorite all-time vintage feels. Some of the bodies I definitely prefer over this one. However, this one, just the nib itself is a gorgeous thing. Okay, so let's take a look, right? So we've got, if you have no pressure, right, it's very fine writing. Now, if you wanted to flex, again, you have to know how to flex, when to flex, and that's pretty much on the downward stroke, right? I'm going to do a little bit of pressure, and I'm going to do, look at that line variation. It's beautiful. And what that means is that when you want to embellish, it's glorious, right? You've got nice fine lines, you've got big thick lines. And these vintages, one of the things that you'll find is they don't railroad. I have yet to really experience a vintage pen that railroads. So railroading is basically when your feed runs out of ink at the flow you're looking for. So with modern pens, you'll often have these kind of like 2 hash marks that look side by side, like a railroad track. That's why it's called that. I've never had vintage pens that do that because, again, these things were made in the day where everybody used them all day, every day. They were meant for heavy use. So these vintage nibs are just a sight to behold. They're amazing in their own right. Now, people will often talk about the vintage feel, and the nibs themselves, like we've been saying, this is the Eggins and Hambler, the Echo, they have a different feel. Now, especially for that size of that nib, and you could get all different sizes, but these are on the smaller side of what you could get, a number 2. It was super flexy. And that's something that can't quite be emulated today. It can be. I've got a Mag 600. I've got the Pilot 743. So I've got flexi pens. I know, what modern flex pens can do. This is a different feel. It's crisper and it's got more snapback. When you come out of your thicker lines, it just, that quick momentary, it just has a quicker snapback. And what that results in is when you're just kind of relaxed writing, you get that embellishment, just that tiny extra bit more because of that crisp snapback, which is not quite what I can find from a modern flex pen. So, conclusions. On vintage pens, I love them. I love the interplay between a hobby that I love, writing with fountain pens, and that interplay of history. I absolutely adore it. I love the fact that when I'm writing with this, many other people have written with this through their history. Were they writing their taxes, their love letters to their wife? Like, it's amazing to think about. And some of them, pro or con, can have a little bit of feel of that, right? So most of these don't have any feel, but then this one in particular, the one that's got the user's initials engraved, this one has a particular feel to it. And what I mean by that is when you start writing with this thing, you can write as typical, but when you do, and you can feel it, you kind of get into a groove with this pen. And that's because the previous user had used it enough that they had imparted pressure on the tines just enough that when you feel that, you really kind of get into that flow. And when I do, and it's something that happens when I'm writing and I notice it, and I'm like, oh, there it is. And it's something that's very intriguing, right? Because I've now, I don't want to say I've become that person, but I have happened into that person's mannerisms. And I have now kind of adapted into their writing, and it's a weird thing. And I really like it, especially coming from history, just coming to that point where I'm like, wow, this is what Edwin, I'm going to call him because it's an E, this is what Edwin did 100 years ago with this very item. So I just think that's super cool. Some of the downsides, as we've said, right? You've got to know what you're getting into. If you don't know what you're getting into, or you don't buy it from someone who is, a professional restorer in that regard, it can be its own nightmare. So you want to get one that's been properly updated with a new sack, and that might run its own kind of expense there. The ink selection is also a downfall, just because you cannot use as many varied inks. I haven't mentioned yet, but you should never, ever, ever use a shimmer ink in a vintage pen, because these pens were not designed in an age that even saw putting little chunks of metal into your ink. So that will definitely clog these up and kind of mess with their viscosity, their flow, their kind of nice usage feel. So don't ever use a shimmer ink in a vintage pen. So again, a downfall is that ink selection, way less with a vintage pen. You really even want to stick with your basic colors. I've even learned that greens and purples, for example, are more likely to cause staining of the celluloid, discoloration, or to prematurely age and wear that sack on the inside. So your ink selections are kind of drastically reduced when you do use a vintage. That said, I just love the interplay of my hobby and history. Like I said, this thing was around at an epic time, and imagine how many letters were written with it, imagine how many hands had used it, and I just find a real connection with these items due to that. That said, the fact that you can also delve into the superflex component of the vintage world is again a niche within a niche within a niche. Like, you are now fountain pens, and then your vintage pens, and then your superflex vintage pens. So it's such a deep rabbit hole, and when you go there, if you like flex pens, you are rewarded in such a way that is irreplicatable. It is unreproducible in today's world, and there are great attempts to try, and they do have their own pros in that regard. However, it's just a different feel, and I really appreciate that in a vintage pen. So thank you all for sticking with me on this deep dive into a vintage pen. I know this is a longer video. We've covered a whole lot, and at some point I will do, individual reviews on these pens. But I hope this gives you a better insight into the world of vintage pens, and if it's something that you might entertain the idea of joining. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, we will see you soon.